Dylan did not enter RJ's life with urgency or drama. She arrived slowly, almost invisibly, the way certain presences do when they understand that patience is more powerful than insistence. At first, she was simply someone who listened. RJ, already exhausted by expectations he never asked for, barely noticed how naturally he began to seek her out. The pressure from Brooke and Ridge weighed heavily on him, pressing him toward a future that felt pre-written, rigid, and suffocating. Forrester Creations was not merely a company to them. It was a legacy, an obligation, a destiny they believed he should accept without question. To RJ, it felt like a cage disguised as privilege. Dylan sensed this immediately, not because she had lived his life, but because she recognized the language of entrapment when she heard it. When RJ spoke about the demands placed on him, the disappointment in his voice was not loud, but it was constant. He described the way every conversation with Brooke circled back to responsibility, how Ridge framed the opportunity as something he should be grateful for rather than something he could choose. Dylan never interrupted. She let silence do the work, allowing RJ to fill it with his own doubts and frustrations. In those quiet spaces, he felt seen in a way he had not experienced within his family. Dylan mirrored his feelings carefully, validating his need for independence without openly encouraging rebellion. She understood that RJ did not want permission to run away. He wanted reassurance that wanting more did not make him ungrateful. Dylan began to share pieces of herself in response, not enough to expose the truth, but enough to create intimacy. She spoke of hardship in abstract terms, of instability, of feeling overlooked and disposable. Her stories were deliberately vague, shaped to invite empathy without inviting scrutiny. She framed her struggles as past challenges she had endured with resilience, crafting an image of quiet strength forged through adversity. What she did not reveal was the reality of her present condition, the nights spent without shelter, the constant calculation required to survive without resources or safety. Dylan understood instinctively that truth, in its raw form, would disrupt the dynamic she was building. Vulnerability was useful only when controlled. RJ responded exactly as she anticipated. Her resilience stirred something protective in him, a desire to be the person who could offer stability rather than be forced into it. In Dylan, he saw a reflection of his own longing for self-definition. She had faced difficulty and survived, while he felt trapped by comfort he had never earned. The contrast unsettled him. Helping Dylan felt like an act of choice, something that belonged to him alone, untouched by family expectations or corporate obligations. It was intoxicating in its simplicity. As their time together increased, Dylan refined her role in RJ's emotional landscape. She never presented herself as someone who needed saving, only someone who appreciated understanding. That distinction was crucial. It allowed RJ to feel empowered without feeling burdened. He began to associate Dylan with relief, with the absence of judgment, with the possibility of a life shaped by decisions rather than inheritance. Dylan encouraged this subtly, reinforcing the idea that independence was not rejection, but self-respect. She spoke of the importance of carving one's own path, of refusing to be defined solely by family legacy. Behind this carefully constructed persona, Dylan remained acutely aware of the precariousness of her situation. Each interaction with RJ was calculated not in cruelty, but in survival. She told herself that she was not lying so much as editing reality, shaping it into something that would allow her to escape a cycle she could no longer endure. Yet beneath that justification lay a deeper awareness. She was not merely seeking help. She was positioning herself within a world of privilege and protection, using emotional resonance as her entry point. RJ, unaware of the extent of Dylan's concealment, found himself increasingly conflicted. His family's insistence that he join Forrester Creations now felt intrusive rather than supportive. The more they pushed, the more he retreated inward, clinging to the sense of agency Dylan represented. He began to question whether accepting the Forrester path would erase the parts of himself he had only just begun to explore. Dylan never told him to reject his family outright. She did not need to. Her presence made the alternative feel more authentic. The danger of their connection lay not in overt manipulation, but in the quiet alignment of need and opportunity. Dylan needed security, connection, and a way out of invisibility. RJ needed affirmation, independence, and a space where his worth was not predetermined. Together, they formed a bond rooted in mutual longing, each projecting onto the other what they most desired. The imbalance remained invisible, masked by shared vulnerability and carefully curated honesty. Dylan's internal conflict intensified as RJ's attachment deepened. There were moments when guilt surfaced unexpectedly, sharp and destabilizing. She wondered what would happen if he discovered the truth, if the image she had built collapsed under the weight of reality. Yet fear always followed closely behind. Fear of returning to the margins. Fear of being unseen again. Fear of losing the one connection that made her feel anchored. In those moments, Dylan reminded herself that survival often required adaptation, that truth was a luxury afforded to those with safety. RJ's desire to help Dylan began to manifest in small but meaningful ways. Offers of assistance framed as concern rather than charity, invitations that extended beyond convenience. Each gesture reinforced his sense of purpose, his belief that he could choose who he wanted to be outside the shadow of Forrester creations. Dylan accepted his support with measured gratitude, careful not to appear dependent, yet allowing enough closeness to deepen the bond. The pressure from Brooke and Ridge did not ease. If anything, it intensified as they sensed RJ pulling away. Their concern transformed into frustration, their encouragement into insistence. They spoke of opportunity, of legacy, of responsibility, but failed to recognize how those words landed on someone already questioning his place in the world. RJ felt increasingly misunderstood, his desire for independence reframed as rebellion. In contrast, Dylan's understanding felt effortless. This contrast sharpened the emotional divide within RJ. He began to associate his family with obligation and Dylan with choice, a dangerous simplification that ignored nuance but satisfied an emotional need. Dylan did not encourage this framing explicitly, yet she did nothing to dismantle it. Her silence functioned as consent, reinforcing the narrative RJ was constructing for himself. The tragedy of their connection lay in its inevitability. Neither Dylan nor RJ entered the dynamic with malicious intent. Each was responding to unmet needs, reaching for something that felt stabilizing in a moment of uncertainty. Yet the foundation of their bond rested on asymmetry. Dylan knew far more about the stakes than RJ did. She understood how fragile her position was, how quickly everything could unravel if the truth surfaced. As time passed, Dylan became increasingly aware that the role she was playing could not be sustained indefinitely. The image of the resilient survivor masked her exhaustion, her hunger, her fear. Maintaining that facade required constant vigilance, constant restraint. Still, the alternative felt unthinkable. To reveal her homelessness, her instability, would risk everything she had gained? It would shift the dynamic from mutual understanding to pity, from partnership to rescue. Dylan feared that more than rejection. RJ, meanwhile, stood at the edge of a decision that would define his future. Joining Forrester Creations meant surrendering autonomy in exchange for security. Stepping away meant uncertainty, but also the promise of self-definition. Dylan's presence tipped the balance, not through coercion, but through possibility. She embodied a life shaped by choice, even if that embodiment was incomplete. What neither of them fully understood yet was that the quiet bond forming between them carried consequences beyond their control. Secrets, once woven into intimacy, rarely remained contained. The truth Dylan concealed was not passive. It waited, patient and unforgiving, for the moment when it would demand acknowledgement. And when that moment arrived, it would test not only Dylan's resilience, but the very foundation of RJ's search for independence. For now, however, the illusion held. Dylan remained the woman who understood without judging. RJ remained the man discovering his own agency. Together, they inhabited a fragile space where empathy masked imbalance and connection blurred into dependency. The calm before the storm felt real enough to trust, and in that calm, both of them allowed themselves to believe, if only briefly, that survival and sincerity could coexist without consequence. Dylan had always understood that families rarely fractured loudly. More often, they split along invisible seams, stress lines created by resentment, competition, and unspoken fear. As she observed the growing tension between Brooke and Katie, she did not need inside knowledge to recognize the pattern. Brooke's authority was threatened not just by Logan's success, but by the fact that Eric's support had shifted the balance of legitimacy. Katie was no longer simply a sister pursuing independence. She was now a rival fortified by legacy itself. Dylan watched this dynamic with careful attention, absorbing the implications without revealing her interest. Where others saw emotional fallout, Dylan saw opportunity, not for immediate gain, but for strategic positioning. RJ, caught between competing loyalties, was the most vulnerable element in this equation. Dylan understood that too. He was young enough to crave validation, old enough to resent being managed, and conflicted enough to be receptive to ideas that framed independence as both rebellion and redemption. Dylan did not rush him. She allowed RJ to speak freely about the pressure he felt from both sides, how Brooke and Ridge pushed him toward Forrester creations, while Katie's rise complicated the narrative of loyalty. Dylan listened closely, not just to his words, but to the emotional weight behind them. He wanted to be respected, not inherited. He wanted to be chosen, not assigned. That was where Dylan began to plant the idea, not as suggestion, but as realization. She framed independence not as separation, but as transcendence. RJ did not need to align himself with Forrester or Logan to prove his worth. In fact, choosing either side too early would only reduce him to a symbol in someone else's war. Dylan spoke carefully, presenting the notion that true respect would come only when both Brooke and Katie were forced to see him as his own force, an individual whose talent existed beyond their rivalry. She emphasized that stepping outside the family battlefield was not abandonment, but evolution. The concept resonated deeply with RJ. It appealed to his desire for autonomy while offering a path that did not require him to reject either side outright. Dylan refined the idea further, suggesting that visibility mattered as much as independence. Talent, when hidden, could be dismissed as potential. Talent revealed on one's own terms demanded acknowledgement. She proposed something bold yet contained, a design competition or a private showcase where RJ could present work unfiltered by Forrester expectations or Logan branding. The emphasis was not on scale, but on authorship. This would be his moment, defined by vision rather than lineage. Dylan positioned herself carefully within this plan. She did not claim expertise she did not possess. Instead, she framed her contribution as conceptual support, creative intuition shaped by hardship and observation. She spoke of perspective gained from living on the margins, of seeing beauty not as luxury, but as survival. Her involvement was presented as complementary, not competitive. She would help RJ translate his instincts into something distinct, something that felt authentic rather than manufactured. In doing so, Dylan subtly aligned her identity with his emerging independence. As the idea took shape, Dylan intensified her presence in RJ's creative process. Late-night brainstorming sessions blurred into emotional confessions. Shared ambition fostered intimacy, and intimacy bred trust. Dylan became not just a collaborator, but a mirror reflecting the version of himself RJ longed to become. She praised his instincts without inflating his ego, reinforcing the belief that his talent was innate and undervalued. Each affirmation strengthened his reliance on her perspective, narrowing the emotional space between them. The secrecy of the project added to its allure. Working outside the gaze of Brooke, Ridge, and Katie created a sense of shared rebellion, a private world defined by mutual belief. Dylan encouraged this dynamic, framing discretion as protection rather than deception. The project was not about hiding, it was about incubation. Yet the longer the secrecy endured, the more it bonded them, transforming collaboration into complicity. As the pressure mounted and anticipation grew, Dylan recognized the moment was approaching when emotional proximity could be transformed into something more binding. She waited for the right circumstances, a late-night work session stretched thin by exhaustion, or a small celebration marking progress on the project. She understood that vulnerability thrived when defenses were lowered, when ambition collided with fatigue and hope blurred into need. That night arrived without spectacle. The atmosphere was not overtly romantic, but charged with the intimacy of shared creation and unspoken dependence. Dylan allowed closeness to develop organically, her presence steady and reassuring. She did not force the moment, she shaped it. By the time the boundary shifted, it felt inevitable rather than impulsive, the natural extension of weeks of emotional alignment. What followed altered everything. Dylan chose that moment to reveal the truth she had been holding back, not about her homelessness or her instability, but something far more binding. She told RJ that she was pregnant. The revelation landed not as drama, but as shock, sudden and destabilizing. RJ's world fractured instantly, the weight of responsibility crashing down on him before he had time to process the implications. Dylan framed the pregnancy not as a mistake, but as meaning. She spoke of fate, of miracles emerging from hardship, of life asserting itself when circumstances seemed most unforgiving. To her, this was not a complication, but confirmation. She described the child as a sign, a reason to believe that everything they were building was meant to be. She expressed her desire not simply to continue their relationship, but to create a family, something stable and intentional in contrast to the chaos she had endured. RJ, already struggling to define himself, found himself overwhelmed by competing emotions. Fear clashed with awe, responsibility collided with disbelief. The timing felt impossible, yet Dylan's framing left little room for doubt. She presented the situation as an opportunity for transformation, a chance for RJ to step into adulthood not through obligation imposed by legacy, but through choice forged by circumstance. Dylan's emphasis on destiny was deliberate. She understood that RJ needed meaning more than reassurance. By casting the pregnancy as a miracle, she transformed uncertainty into purpose. She did not demand commitment outright, she assumed it, weaving the expectations seamlessly into the narrative of their shared future. In her telling, this was not an interruption to RJ's journey, but its culmination. Internally, Dylan wrestled with the weight of what she had set in motion. There was fear, undeniable and sharp. Fear of exposure, fear of rejection, fear that the truth she continued to conceal would eventually surface. Yet beneath that fear was conviction. This was her chance to anchor herself permanently in a world that had previously excluded her. The child represented not only survival, but legitimacy, a bond that could not be dismissed or ignored. RJ's shock deepened into confusion as he struggled to reconcile the revelation with his ongoing search for identity. He had been seeking independence, not permanence. He had wanted respect, not obligation. Yet Dylan's framing left him feeling that refusal would not simply be rejection, but betrayal of something sacred. He felt trapped by the weight of expectation, even as he was drawn toward the idea of building something of his own. The irony was cruel. In his attempt to escape predetermined paths, RJ found himself standing at the threshold of a new one, shaped not by family legacy, but by circumstance and emotion. Dylan, positioned as both collaborator and partner, now became the axis around which his future threatened to revolve. As the reality settled in, the stakes of Dylan's manipulation grew exponentially. The secret project, the pregnancy, the promise of independence all converged into a single narrative that bound RJ to her. Whether born of genuine belief or calculated survival, Dylan's actions had irrevocably altered the balance of power between them. What remained uncertain was not the intensity of the moment, but its sustainability. Secrets, especially those layered upon ambition and fear, rarely remain contained. Dylan's vision of destiny depended on continued concealment, continued control of the narrative. RJ's response, shaped by shock and longing, could shift once clarity replaced emotion. For now, however, the illusion held. Dylan stood beside RJ as both muse and miracle, her presence imbued with meaning he had not anticipated but felt compelled to honor. Together, they faced a future suddenly crowded with consequence, one where independence and responsibility collided in ways neither fully understood. The calm that followed was fragile, suspended between belief and reality. Dylan clung to it, aware that the moment truth demanded its due, everything she had built could unravel. RJ, overwhelmed but committed, stepped forward into a role he had not planned but could no longer avoid. And in that quiet aftermath, destiny lingered not as certainty, but as a question waiting to be answered, one that would test the limits of love, truth, and the cost of survival in a world where legacy and longing were forever intertwined.